you are, without a doubt, one of the salient leaders in higher education, a disruptive innovator. As means of introduction, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Minerva is, and especially about this distinctiveness of integrating active pedagogies with advanced technologies?
Sure. If you really want to think about why we exist, we exist to help universities evolve and to combat two of the great fallacies of education. So fallacy number one is that exposure equals knowledge. Now, we wouldn't necessarily say it that way, but we oftentimes think in universities, well, you know, you went to class, you were told to read something, you got a lecture about it, you've now been exposed to that information, now you know it. And obviously that's just not true, right? And in fact, even when you cram for an exam, for example, and you pass the exam, you often forget what it is that you've just tested. And so in order to really learn, in order to actually absorb the information, you have to be an active participant in it. And there's been research for many decades, even preceding Minerva, around active learning and how much more effective active learning is versus passive. Passive is more you sit and hear a lecture. Active learning is where you actually struggle with applying the information. And what we did is we developed a technique called fully active learning, which ensures that throughout the process of a course, really throughout the process of an entire program, every single student is actively applying the work, actively applying the knowledge, the vast majority of their time in class. So it's a dramatically different type of approach. The second fallacy is that knowledge equals learning. And that's actually a more nuanced issue. We think in higher education where we say, hey, do you know something or not know something? Or how well do you know it? But the problem is that knowing something doesn't mean you know how to apply it. I'll give you probably the easiest example of this. I'm sure that every single person watching, every single person here has been in some talk and they find it unbelievably boring and disengaging, right? They sit there and say, oh my God, I can't believe how boring this person is, how unengaging that person is, etc. And then when they're asked to give a talk, they also may be very boring and unengaging because giving an effective talk takes a long time to master. Now, it's weird because you should think, well, they know it's bad. They know what would make it good. So why is it that they can't just immediately deliver a great talk? There is a difference between knowing and applying, right? And the way to learn how to effectively apply something isn't just to know the theory behind it. It's not even to know the practice of how to do it in one particular context, but the ability to do it across all contexts. And so Minerva created an approach that's not only pedagogical, but also curricular, that enables you to absorb information and be able to apply it in context after context until it becomes generalizable in your brain, until you can do it basically in any situation you may encounter. And technology is necessary for both of those tasks, right? Technology ensures that what happens in a classroom is that it enables the professor to engage the students more directly, right? It gives the professor tools without which is too difficult to both conduct a class and make sure everybody is engaged. And it connects learning from one session to another, sometimes from one class to another, if it's done well, such that a student is able to apply what it is that they've learned with spaced, deliberate practice across context. And the technology ties all of that together.
So one of the papers that is mentioned in your bio it's research from many years ago that sustains a good portion of what you have described. Why is it that it's now just recently coming to be applied? Is it because technology is available to do so? Is technology the big enabler for this game?
Yeah, it's a fascinating problem, right? Because yes, technology does make it easier, but technology has also now been around for a long time. We've been doing what we've been doing for now over a decade, and not a lot of other people are doing the same thing. So you have a twofold issue. Number one, yes, technology does enable it to be much more widespread if done correctly. But the second is the incentive. The reality is I had a professor when I was in college many decades ago, and he said that there is a devil's bargain that exists between professor and student, which is the less work they both do, the happier they both are. Right? And so there's a reality, what we refer to as hyperbolic discounting. And hyperbolic discounting means that you estimate the cost for you today compared to the benefit in the future, meaning you underestimate the return that you get from investment. This is particularly true the younger you are. In fact, hyperbolic discounting physiologically doesn't really get as overcome as a human being would until the age of 25. And so when you tell someone early on in life, hey, you really should study hard and do this, and boy, it'll be worthwhile in the long run, it's a very hard sell. And so you have all of these factors where active learning requires more work, right? It requires you to engage with the material. It doesn't mean that you can just, screw around all semester long and then cram for the final and you'll be okay. It means that you've got to engage with the material every single day, every single session. And the same thing for the professor. The professor needs to give feedback to students all the time, right? To make sure that they're engaged. And so the process of getting an institution to adopt this, as opposed to an individual professor who decides, hey, this is the right thing to do, that's been historically a challenge. Today, what's happened is that the devil's bargain has played out so much that universities have resorted to great inflation, right? So basically, they have lower standards today than they did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the problem is, at some point, education does matter, right? And employers are now looking at the output of universities and they're dissatisfied. So now there is external pressure on universities to reform. And for us, that's a really important time in history, because you have the technology and the capability to allow universities to reform, and the pressure from the outside to do that. And that's coming at the right time. We see all over the world to get universities to actually recommit to not just better learning, but a dramatically better learning than they've ever been able to do before.
And I'm glad that you mentioned this concepts regarding how administrators and how schools and universities need to look at these new challenges, because we're talking about a millenary institution now being confronted with the possibilities and the demands of a world that's fueled by AI and the new technologies. So in our Masters of Education program, and we have a number of students connected to this presentation, we have students who are focused precisely on higher education management. So what would you say to leaders? You are speaking to our board of trustees later today. What would you say to leaders, presidents, principals, superintendents? How should they look at these challenges, and how should they process what technologies, what the investments that are required are to be considered in the future?
So I come from Silicon Valley, right? And I very much believe in the approach of what successful startups do. Now, most startups are not successful, and romanticizing the entrepreneurial process is not particularly a good idea, especially when you look at the failure rates of startups. But the successful startups start with the problem and work their way back towards an ideal solution. The unsuccessful startup starts with the current way of doing things, and then, or the current technology that they've developed, and then say, what do I do with it? How do I increment from it? Those types of efforts are doomed to fail. Whereas ones that work from the problem back will succeed. And I'll give you a very clear example of what will happen to universities if all they think about is to increment. So today, imagine the cost of a university. Now, forget the physical cost. Forget the cost of the professors and
those are the obvious ones.
That's right, and all the rest. Just think about the time, right? You're asking a learner as an undergraduate, for example, to spend 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, depending on the context of their lives, in order to achieve a particular goal. Now, if the goal is you're going to come inside to the institution at 18 and you're going to leave and you're going to get this job, there are quicker, cheaper ways of getting to that job, almost by definition. And somebody is going to come up with better ways of doing that. We're already seeing elements of that happening all over the world, right? People that, for example, coding boot camps. And say, well, you want to be a software engineer? Why spend 4 years at university? Come 6 months in my institution, a year, and you get a higher paying job than you do as a university graduate. You're going to see more and more of these alternatives that are going to pop up. Now, what is a university going to do in that situation? Is it going to say, oh, okay, well, we'll do a 1-year course also? Well, there are regulatory issues, right? There's all sorts of constraints. You already have your current students. How do you tell one student, well, you come for 1 year versus you come for 4? So the university has to actually be able to prove, wait a second, it's not just about getting that job. We're actually providing additional value, added value. You can get jobs you can't get normally because they're requiring higher order thinking skills. We teach those skills. You see the trajectory of careers that are going to be better. And the reality is that's what universities have been trying to say. There's almost no proof that universities do that. And so if you then think about it and say, well, that is the imperative. In order for us to survive as institutions, we have to be able to demonstrate to students that they can get the kinds of opportunities and the kind of acceleration of opportunities afterwards. What is it that students need to be tooled with? And then you ask, oh, okay, well then you don't just need to learn a subject matter, you need to be able to apply what you learn no matter what it is that you do. And how do you do that? Well, you have a much more well thought through curriculum. It's not just, hey, take 30 courses at random and you get a degree and you finish, right? It's, oh, you now have to connect those things. You have to do all of those other things. And so what you do is you go back and you rethink the structure of the institution. Then you layer on the constraints. Then you say, here's the budget that we have and the physical plan and the professors. And then you say, okay, well, how do I get from here to there? Right? But you don't start saying, oh, here's all of my constraints. And now, oh, maybe I'll increment this and I'll increment that. You really want to start with a clean slate and then figure out how you bridge those gaps. Because if universities don't do that, universities are not, there's no law written that they will always exist, right? And there will be a disruptive wave that is going to have a profound impact on the sector.
Now, let me throw two questions at you. The first would be, is society ready for a change such as the one that you're describing, where you're going to tell your parents and you're going to tell your employers that you didn't go to a traditional 4-year college or university, but you got your learning in 2 years through A, B, or C option, and you're all set to take on the world?
Yeah, I think it is, and I'll give you some evidence as to why that is. Over the past 20 or 30 years, we have seen a level of public opinion shifts that we've never seen in history. And you see it across all sorts of subject areas. I'll give you an example from the United States. In 2004, less than 30% of Americans were approving of the idea of same-sex marriage. It was a wildly unpopular perspective. It was so unpopular that when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he was opposed to same-sex marriage, as was Hillary Clinton, as was the entire Democratic Party and the entire Republican Party. 10 years later, by 2014, not only was same-sex marriage the law in the United States, it had over 70% support. Right? Now, a shift of that magnitude in 10 years on a subject like that, what is almost unprecedented in history. Now, if you look at public trust in institutions, you see the exact same type of movement in the opposite direction. Over the past 20 years, the public trust of institutions, and it's true all over the world, has plummeted. Again, if you look at around that same time as that view of same-sex marriage in the United States, more than 70% of the American population trusted institutions of higher education. Today, it's a little over 30%. And so there's been a shift, at least in the United States, it's true in other countries as well, in trust of these institutions. That is an environment that is ripe for somebody to come in and say, great, I'm going to provide a real alternative. And in fact, it's an environment ripe for a lot of people to come in and do that. And once it takes hold in the United States, for better or worse, the world looks up to American higher education. And as American higher education becomes more and more vulnerable, it's not that people will say, oh, okay, well, I guess American universities aren't as good as we thought they were, but boy, universities, in China or in Germany or wherever, there must be great. It's going to bring down the entire global sector. The entire global sector will say, if you have said over decades that you look up to those institutions and now there's a better alternative to them, for sure there's a better alternative to everybody else.
So my second question, and it is connected to this one that you're just wrapping up, is where does educating the whole individual and producing well-rounded graduates, citizens of the world who are able to think critically, to communicate effectively, to be open and tolerant, and so on. Basically, the tenets of a liberal arts education. Where does that fit into all this? Because I can see the case for speeding up the acquisition and the development of knowledge through technology and so on, and maybe doing in 2 years what we could do regularly in 4 years. But where does personal growth and preparing citizens and individuals fall into all of this?
So I think that is the pathway for universities. I think it is the most important role that they can play, that personal growth, the ability not to say you come here and at 17, you know what your career is going to be for the rest of your life, which we know is absurd. But here's the problem. Universities have been saying that for decades. They've been saying that since the beginning of the liberal arts model 250 years ago. The problem is more and more, they produce the exact opposite, right? More and more, when individuals, again, looking at the United States, graduating from universities, who do they produce? They produce effective citizens. They produce people who are open-minded. Do they produce people who actually want to engage with people who think differently from them? No.
Not necessarily.
They engage people who have dogmatic perspectives that are often stupid, that are wrong. They will not listen to science. They will not listen to other perspectives. They won't look at evidence. They virtue signal as opposed to actually think deeply. They cancel. They keep people from speaking, right? And to me, that is the core problem. I'll give you a very quick story about, there was a conference I attended many years ago, not many years ago, 6-7 years ago, where a number of Minerva students were invited. And one of the participants in the conference was a professor at a traditional university. And she told me, she said, oh, at the end of the conference, she said, listen, I've got to give you some feedback about your students because, it was bothering me, a couple of incidents that I saw. And I said, oh, I'd love to hear, what you experienced. She says, well, your students were just in India. Minerva students live in various countries around the world, and they were just in India. And I asked them when they were in India if they put on the local clothing, attire. And they said that, yeah, there were incidents in which they did. And I asked them, well, what about cultural appropriation? And they said, well, we considered it, but our hosts were Indian, asked us to do that for celebrations, and so we thought it was okay. I listened to it. I said, okay. She says, well, how is it that you didn't teach them the problems of cultural appropriation? And I said, well, we don't teach them any one perspective. They obviously knew what it was, and they evaluated it, and they made the decision. I said, did you give them your perspective on what cultural appropriation? She said, absolutely, I did. I said, and what do they react? And she said, well, they said that was a really good point, and they think about it. And I said, well, isn't this what you want every student to do?
That's the purpose, right?
That's the whole point, right? They came to a particular conclusion. You challenge that conclusion, and they say, that's an interesting perspective. Let me incorporate that. And she thought about it. And to her credit, she said, you know what? You're right. She hadn't thought about it before because she came from a traditional context. And then she said to me, well, that would make the second incident that much more troubling. I said, okay, well, what happened? She says, well, there was a conversation I was a part of, and there was a student that came in, and there was a very accomplished older gentleman that was in the conversation. He started saying some things, and the student started yelling at them, saying, you're not able to do that. You're not able to say that, this inappropriate, and all the rest. It was completely inappropriate. And I said, well, that is completely inappropriate. I said, I want that student's name. She gave me the student's name, and I said, oh, that's not a Minerva student. That student just graduated from Yale. and to me, that's the microcosm of the issue, right? That institutions don't understand anymore the liberal arts imperative. That to be an effective citizen, sure, you should have opinions and perspectives, but you should always be looking to grow. You should always be looking to learn from others. It doesn't mean that you'll change your opinion, right? But it means that you're open for your opinion to be changed. And that's something that is no longer in the fabric of our institutions. That's the ultimate reform that has to happen, right? Where students are given the tools to be constantly growing, constantly evaluating, right? And do so in a way that makes a society cohesive again, right? Not that a society never has always agreed on issues, but where it can engage in debate, in dialogue, even if it's fierce, but enable a community that can differ in opinion without feeling like they're excluded.
And what's failing? Why are we going down that slippery slope? Is it a problem of leadership? Is it a problem of technology that is being manipulated to embed into us certain ways of thinking? I mean, what is missing?
Well, there are a number of underlying causes. Yes, it's a multi-factor. Factor number one is that if you look at universities 100 years ago, and you were to go to any university faculty, and you were to say, the faculty of the university own the curriculum, then the faculty would say, yes, the faculty as a whole own the curriculum as a whole. A curricular perspective is an undergraduate comes into our institution and they go through a curricular process, a program of study, and they graduate having learned what we as a collective faculty believe is important for them to know. Today, if you go to a faculty and say, the faculty own the curriculum, the faculty will most likely say, absolutely, which means I can do whatever I want in my class. Those two things cannot coexist. You cannot have an institutional perspective of what an education looks like and have 100 or 1,000 free agents doing whatever they want. Right? Yeah. And that's a core problem of the devolution of education. Whereas we confuse academic freedom, which is crucial, right? Which is the ability to research, is the ability to put forward controversial opinions and ideas, right? With a free-for-all in education, right? It is not an opinion that a student needs to be able to understand the difference between a fact and a claim. It's not an opinion that a student needs to be able to apply various statistical tools and models to data. It's not an opinion that a student needs to understand how to communicate so their audience can understand what it is that they're saying. Like, those things can only be achieved through curricular alignment, such that it doesn't rely on a professor maybe teaching a student those tools, right? And so that's, I think, the underlying problem. There are other factors as well. There are factors that are related to how universities attain prestige. It used to be, many years ago, that universities were primarily prestigious as teaching institutions. When the United States imported the German research university model in the late 19th century and then perfected it 40 years later, the shift became that universities got their prestige not just from teaching, but from research. But that turbocharged in the 1960s, where universities, for a variety of factors, based on government funding, based on the curricular devolution, right, rejecting curricula and allowing more openness in what pathways exist, so a student can basically get a degree from doing very little. It shifted dramatically to citation index, to what gets cited more. Now, in science, what gets cited more goes through a particular scientific process. Right, the research is assessed by peers. It is tested. It has to be replicated, and even when things get published that cannot be replicated, eventually those bad studies get flushed out of the system. In the humanities and social sciences, that is not necessarily true, and in fact, what often gets cited more are opinions that are more popular.
I see.
And so what happens is that as opinions that are popular become de rigueur, they become the default of what's being taught, right? What happens is it's very hard to publish and get your paper cited for opposing opinions. Whereas in science, it's built in to the process. And so that means that the intellectual environment of universities becomes much more prone to a monoculture of ideas, as opposed to a heteroculture, which is really what we need.
Systemic problem. And you were talking about owning the curricula. We just read in the Chronicle 1 week, 2 weeks ago about this professor at Pomona College. And that, I mean, it's a 3-page article. And for those of you who are listening, if you want to take a look at how things can really go wrong at a very good institution, that's the case too. Okay, so let me bring this down, because among our audience, we have a number of teachers from elementary schools and high school. We've been talking mostly about what happens at the higher ed level. How do you see all of these factors unfolding at the elementary, K-12, and so on?
So I actually think that the K-12 sector has the even more important role than higher education. Why? Because effectively everybody goes through a K-12 experience, whereas higher education is for a portion of the population still. Now, what I find kind of fascinating, and I actually think that in Mexico, and especially at CETYS, there's a more clear-eyed view of it, is that people think of there's a K-12 sector and there's a higher education sector, and they're totally separate. And the reality is that they're not. And if I actually had to put the dividing line, I think the dividing line is the difference between primary education and then secondary and post-secondary education. Because the reality is that primary education, you're educating a different creature.
Okay.
Right? Before we hit puberty, we're a different animal than we are after we hit puberty. Right? Our brain is different. The way we learn is different. What we need to learn is different. Right? And by and large, primary education is broadly well understood, right? Where you get your reading, your writing, your math, you understand scaffolding, you introduce a concept, you repeat it, you practice it over and over and over again. And by and large, we know how to generate literate, numerate students. Now, it doesn't mean that we do it at all places. There are obviously a bunch of disparities in how we get to do it, but there's enough good examples out there that you don't need to be a significant innovator to be able to say, okay, let's just use best practices. Secondary education really is now the same as higher education. It's the same creature. Now, you just emerged from puberty, so your brain is still developing and still forming, but the principles are the same. You're now able to have complex thinking, layered thinking. You're able to apply abstractions, which you cannot do before puberty. And therefore, the curricular approach in secondary education is incredibly important. But even worse than higher education, curricula in high schools are almost completely non-existent. What do I mean by that? In higher education, at least there are clear sequences where you study certain things, right? You'll do economics 101, then you'll do economics 102, and then you'll do economics 201 and economics 202. You'll take 12 courses in economics, and there's at least in theory, a building from one to the other. What happens in high school? You take biology, you take it for 1 year, and then you never touch it again. You take chemistry for 1 year, and you never touch it again, right? You'll do algebra, then you'll do geometry, right? You will do world history, and then you'll do national history, right? And these are all completely separate units. And what's worse, they don't even contemplate how they affect one another. Forget the sequence within science or history or math. What about how math impacts history or how science impacts literature? People can't even conceive of that in high school. But the reality is that is the way the world works. We don't encounter math in the world. We don't encounter history. We don't encounter literature in a vacuum. All of these things are integrated into the world's actual experiences. And the underlying tools to be able to evaluate and work in one field are as relevant in the other as they are in the field in which they are oftentimes introduced. You need to evaluate a claim in every single one of these fields. You have to be able to understand cause and effect in every one of these fields. You have to understand emergent properties, second order effects, unintended consequences. You have to understand how human beings interact, biases. All of these things play into every field of knowledge. And we assume that we can wait until college to address these things. We cannot, right? And so to me, I think that if you really want to focus on K-12 education, the part which requires the biggest intervention is certainly high school, which I think needs a complete overhaul. Whereas in early childhood education, you need to work on closing disparities, but you broadly know how to do that.
Yeah.
It just is the will and the political will and the resources that are necessary to make that happen.
And what could with the typical average teacher from a K-12 do on her own or his own if most of this has to do with a curricular design that goes well beyond a single individual? How do you get traction? How do you start moving? What can you do within the realm of your classroom if your supervisors or your directors are not in sync with these ideas?
So this is the imperative for those who will manage, because I do believe that it is a systemic issue. And there are countless examples of teachers who do amazing work.
Yeah.
We've all had them. We've all had incredible teachers who cared, who engaged students, who didn't just lecture at them, right? Who asked them, who challenged them, who raised standards. If I think about the best teachers I had in high school and in college, they were the hardest ones. There was the ones that were the most demanding of me, right? They're the ones that gave me confidence because they asked more of me, right? And so there are many things that a teacher can do to inspire students, to connect with them, to bring in active learning techniques, to use correct pedagogies in class. But sadly, that cannot fix the problem, because the reality is, especially when you look at the population, just think about it in a normal, distribution. In a normal distribution, right? The standard deviation around the mean accounts for the majority of student experience, right? And of course, once you get past that first standard deviation, you get some really great opportunities. But that's only about
outliers.
Exactly. It's in the teens of the percentages, right? And in general, when we go and look at teacher efficacy and quality, that's broadly what we see. 15%, give or take a few percentage points, of teachers are engaging and exceptional and all the rest. In a curricular model where you encounter a subject and then never come back to it, when only 15% of your teachers are going to be effective, you cannot learn. It is an impossibility. And what's worse is that 15%, and this is where we have problems of equity, are not evenly distributed, right? Those 15, it's not that every single school, 15% of the teachers are great and 85% are average to bad, right? What usually happens is that in some schools, you may have 30, 40, 50% of teachers being very good and engaging. And in other schools, you may have 2, 3, 4%. And neither is a great model, but obviously one is dramatically better than the other. We have been resigning ourselves in both in high school and in college to just both rely and blame the particular teacher for all of the problems that we have. We say, oh, what can we do to give teachers the resources, give teachers the tools and the help and all the rest? Well, that's folly. You cannot forget, a school's fate, forget even a country's fate. You cannot put humanity's fate on individuals that are overwhelmed, overworked, usually underpaid, right? Yep. in order to fix those problems. You have to actually fix the structure that enables that standard deviation across the mean to be good, right? Because once you have the right structure, now you're not relying on a regular normal curve where the average is not acceptable, right? And you've got 66% of experiences on average, and then, equally distributed between terrible and good on the extremes. If the structure is right, now you have more than 80% of learning that becomes effective. And that is how you actually fix systems, right?
But as if this wasn't hard enough, then we have regulation,
right?
And we have the accreditors, among others. What's their stance on this?
So this is I find to be an interesting thing. When I started Minerva, I was told, oh my gosh, the accreditors, they're barriers, they create all of these problems. I said, okay, well, let's have a look, right? What is it that they ask? The reality is that accreditation systems, now I've worked with, more than a dozen accreditors all over the world. They all, they have a lot of bureaucracy. They ask for a lot of things, but the reality is that what they constrain are what I refer to as the containers, right? They'll say, you've got to put your things into the container that looks like this: a certain amount of time, a certain number of courses, the qualifications for the teachers, etc. And the containers are rigid. They sometimes don't make any sense, but that's all they are. They're containers, right? And if somebody says, put something into a box versus put something into a cylinder, okay, you understand it's a box versus a cylinder, and then you say, okay, I'm going to shape it this way and all the rest. But the meat, the substance, is really quite flexible. And so when I started Minerva, rather than saying, you know what, I'm going to reject the accreditation process, I'm going to do something outside of it, I said, no. I'm going right into the accreditation process. I'm going to comply with every single demand the accreditor has, which, by the way, almost no university in America does, right? They comply with some, but not others, and all the rest. No, I'm going to comply with everything. And I'm going to show that even with all of those constraints, I can produce an extraordinary outcome, which we have. Now, would it be slightly easier if I didn't have those constraints? Sure. If I would have created the constraints from scratch, would they look like that? No. But they're not at a point where they prevent the structural changes that need to happen. They just make them a little bit harder.
Good. So let me just jump really quickly into a question about technology. We've seen a number of technologies. I mean, we say AI, just give it a broad scope, augmented retrieval generation, enhanced learning, enhanced reality. A number of these technologies are indeed enablers, but are geared towards efficiency. Is any one of these a game changer?
So, I often give the example that if you allowed the education technology sector 15 years ago to develop a solution for ride sharing, right, or for transportation, what they would do is they would build an app that would turn on the flashlight of your phone so you can hail taxis more easily. Right? And to me, almost all of the conversations around technology, as you said, augmented reality, AI, adaptive learning, etc., all they are increments at doing the same thing we do today, sometimes marginally better, sometimes marginally worse. Right? And so in my view, the game changer is not the underlying technology. It is how you develop it, how you implement it. Ride sharing was a game changer, right? Not because you had GPS, but because you said, well, in a world of GPS, if I need to get a human being from one point to another in a highly regulated industry, which is public transportation, what is the ideal model of getting a person from here to there? And now, all of a sudden, the idea that you stand on a street and you hope somebody will drive by that you can wave your hand and stop seems so completely absurd.
Exactly.
Right? It's just, it's, if I were to tell you, oh, okay, I'm going to go find somebody, just go on, stand on the street corner and wait for someone today, you would say, what? Are you crazy? Who would do such a thing? Right? I mean, it's so incomprehensible to us. Yet 15 years ago was the only way to do it. Right? And it's just such a fascinating thing when you realize what can be done. And so the game changer isn't really the technology in and of itself. It is the application of it that makes what we did in the past look absurd.
Okay. How do you connect this to individual learning? We want to provide the students with the opportunity to develop his or her own experiences, experiential learning. You talk about the versions of it. How do you raise the potential for them to be able to do this through technology?
Yeah. So I think that's an excellent perspective. And I do think we have the broad frameworks for where individualized and personalized learning comes in and where it shouldn't. Except I think in the current system, the lines of delineation are not well thought through. I think that you have three kinds of learning engagements that broadly mirror what you have today, but I think that that they need to be shifted and redefined. So in general, when you think about what a learning journey is today, you have homework, right? You have live synchronous classes, or you have some kind of social learning, and then you've got some kind of applications. And broadly, that is true. But the role of those areas should be very, very different. Homework, almost by definition, is personalized. But if you now are aware of technology, you can personalize it in far more effective ways. One very straightforward example in elementary school education is that overwhelmingly today, students use adaptive learning platforms for math. Right? They get assigned, your addition, multiplication, etc. You'll go to a website, IXL or one of those, and you'll do a problem set, right? But the problem set isn't what a teacher writes and gives you on paper. It's what is automatically generated by the machine based on how you answer the previous questions. They'll say, oh, you understand this concept, we'll give you, we don't need to do that anymore, or you struggle with this, or you get it sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and we'll give you the kind of problem sets until you are ready. You can take that same approach for a lot of learning or homework in content acquisition and knowledge acquisition for high school, for university, even though that's rarely used. So that's, I think, an area which, especially now, there's a lot of energy around the personal tutor, the AI tutor, right? That's all about knowledge acquisition. Then you have social learning. And social learning is the part where you're an expert and a group of peers are best utilized for learning. And that's where frameworks come in. That's where you don't learn what's true or false. You learn what's false and maybe true, the black and gray, right? And that's where you actually want to have active learning, debates, different types of perspectives, and you focus on that as a whole. So where personalized learning is actually not needed. In fact, it could be destructive because now you have one perspective, right? Where you want to see the human diversity of opinion and how people come to perspective and deal with that. And then you have that experiential learning, the applications. And to me, some part of experiential learning can also be done socially, but the best examples of experiential learning are ones where the student has acquired knowledge, understood frameworks, applied them socially, and now they are challenged with going to the real world and applying them in ways that make sense for them in new contexts, right? And so to me, an educational program that covers those three elements well, that integrates them, are the educational programs that are going to be successful in the future.
Thank you, Ben. That last comment that you made answered directly the only question that we got through our chat box, because we were not set up for this, but we still got one. Antonio Ramirez was asking about how engagement can be achieved. So I think you already addressed that. So we thank Antonio for his question. Well, it's time to wrap it up. I'm just going to say that CETYS University has been immersed in non-conventional education. We started back into 2015 with an offer of online courses and adapting the curriculum of our bachelor programs. And in late 2022, with a new set of virtual programs. We now are trying to get graduate and executive programs that respond to this new profile of student who prefers flexibility, technology, mediated education in a synchronous and or asynchronous way. Even some who want to have the option of being able to attend certain classes, events, and so on in person. And this is happening through CETYS Virtual Campus that Lucia heads. So within that context and within that framework and within the scope of our Masters of Education program is that we are having this conversation. Ben, we thank you so much for being here. Any parting thoughts that we have like 2 minutes if you want to share something before we wrap up?
I will just say that we are so excited about the work that you're doing at CETYS, about our engagement together. And we hope that it is a kernel of a collaboration that will expand and continue to build on the great work you've been doing over these past few years.
Well, thank you so much. We are proud to partner with you. I think it's well in line with our intention of being an innovative institution. We will be sharing with the public at large as soon as we're ready to do so, what is exactly that we're doing. But I think it's going to be wonderful for the years to come. So thank you again. It's a pleasure to having you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.